So he had told me that he has a hand waving. The moment that comes down, that means we are live now. Okay, so he's saying we are live streaming now, so we can start.
Welcome everybody. I'm Amar Bhattacharya from the Brookings Institution and the Grantham Research Institute. It's a privilege for me to moderate the second session of the second panel of ICRIER's 13th annual G20 conference. I've had the privilege to participate in these annual conferences over many years. They are really, they add great value to the discussion in India and in connecting India to the world. So the title of our session is Coherent Response for a Post-COVID-19 recovery, balancing strong with sustainable recovery. And I have a few slides just to set the context. I will introduce the panel members as they speak. So if I can go to the first slide, please. Okay, if you just put it on slide presentation and just the first slide. Okay, so the second slide, please. So 18 months after the onset of the COVID crisis, the world is in the midst of a protracted and, very importantly, divergent recovery. And for two reasons: the extent of policy support and the uneven and asymmetric rollout of vaccines. In advanced economies, paradoxically, the outlook now for the medium term is better than it was before the crisis because of exceptional policy support, both fiscal and monetary. In China, too, the growth path is pretty much back to where it was expected to be. Of course, there are uncertainties in both cases. But in contrast to that, in middle-income countries at all levels and in low-income countries, the outlook now is significantly worse. And that is the challenge that we are facing today, a divergent recovery. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is against a backdrop of decelerating investment growth after the financial crisis. So the previous decade was one where we had seen declining investment and declining productivity. Third slide. And the impact of COVID has been particularly strong on investment. While GDP growth of emerging markets and developing countries did not decline as much as advanced economies in 2020, investment growth declined very sharply. And as you can see, particularly the contrast to the 2009 crisis, especially for low-income countries. Low-income countries were barely affected in the global financial crisis, but this time round, the impact on investment is very severe. Next slide, please. So against that backdrop, we've had already responses. And I just want to make 2 points about the response and then close with one philosophical point. Most of the response until now has been in terms of stimulus for rescue, meaning government consumption, private consumption, wages, income support. The recovery component until now has been quite small, even in advanced economies. And if you go to the next slide, and in emerging markets and developing countries, actually the recovery component has been extremely small. And within that, the green component has been really negligible. So the philosophical point I want to end with is, if we do not have a strong recovery, we will not have a sustainable recovery, because investment and innovation are the way not just out of this COVID crisis, but to build back better and to secure the transformation we need. And if we do not have a sustainable response, we will not have a strong response, because an unsustainable response will fall on its own sword. So with that, let me turn to the panelists. We have 3 excellent panelists. They are Jean Pisani-Ferry, Richard Damania, and Ulka Kelkar. We will begin with Richard Damania. Richard is the chief economist of the Sustainable Development Practice Group in the World Bank. He has held several positions in the World Bank, including as senior advisor in the water practice, lead economist in the Africa region, South Asia, Latin America. It reminds me of all the kind of trajectories one takes in the World Bank, Richard. His work has spanned multiple sectors, and he has helped the World Bank become an acknowledged thought leader on matters relating to environment, water, and economy. Prior to joining the World Bank, he was a professor of economics at the University of Adelaide. The floor is yours, Richard. The way we are structuring this is we will have opening interventions of about 10 minutes each from you, and then we will move to a Q&A format, initially amongst yourselves and then with the audience.
Thank you so much, Amar. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are from. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. If you bear with me for a moment, I will seek to share my screen with you, and that will take just a moment to upload. I'm hoping that you can see it all. You can see my screen now as I put it on full screen mode. All right, so let's begin and let's remind ourselves why we are here and why we actually have this session. 2020, and really for the last 6 months, has been about 16 to 18 months or a year like no other that we have experienced. And even though we are seeing the beginnings of a recovery, especially if we focus on developing countries, World Bank projections tell us that 130 million people have dipped into poverty. So this is the first time in a very long time we have actually seen poverty increasing. Add to that, of course, the hidden death toll of deaths. The number is contested by some governments, but it's surely at least 3 million, if not more. Sicknesses in the hundreds of millions. And even if there is a recovery, and no matter what form it has been, that recovery has left a vast amount of debt in both developed countries and developing countries to the extent to which they could afford stimulus spending. In other words, we have an overhang of debt, we have an overhang of poverty, we have an overhang of sickness. It's reasonable then for us to ask, is this as good as it gets in the world economy? Are we on the right path? Or could there be something better? So to answer that question, it's useful to step back into the fundamentals of development economics and ask ourselves what development is really about. At its most basic and foundational level, development and economic growth is about balancing your portfolio of assets. So what is your portfolio of assets? It's human capital, of course, which is vital, physical capital, intangible capital, call it social capital if you wish, and indeed natural capital. Sometimes we seem to forget the latter two because they're less visible or taken for granted, intangible capital and natural capital. And yet we know that everything that we do depends on those invisible capitals. The quality of air, for example, for those of you living in Delhi, you know that affects your health and your human capital. That affects the economy. And that's a sign of unequal, unbalanced growth. Let's now look at the progress that the world has made before we dip down very quickly into India to look at what sort of progress has been made on human capital, physical capital, and natural capital. Let's paint with a broad brush. Take any measure that you desire of human capital or physical capital, look at the trajectory pre-COVID, before COVID hit, and you will observe considerable progress. So one of the most important is infant mortality rates. About 60 or 70 years ago, 40 to 50% of every child that was born on earth was unlikely to survive into adulthood. Today, that number is down to about 15% and sometimes even less globally. 50 years ago, 1 in every 2 people that you would have met would have been functionally illiterate. Today, that number is less than 20%. In 1980, which was not so long ago, many of you were alive then, the poverty rate, the number of people in extreme poverty, was roughly about 40% of humanity. Just before COVID hit, that number was down to 9%. And indeed, transport costs have declined dramatically. We're extremely good at building roads, telecommunications networks, and so on. So, you get roads all the time being constructed, for example, in India. We are very, very well connected. If we look at our access to services like water, about 80% of the world have access to some water, not of the quality we desire or the reliability, but some water. And about 90% have access to some electricity, again, not the quality that we desire. Now turn your gaze to any measure you desire of natural capital, be it air, land, or water. You will observe again, almost without exception, that these are all in secular decline. Let's start with the monochrome image that everyone focuses on, climate change. You all know the story. Physics demands that if you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, temperatures must rise, things get hotter, sea ice melts, you get rising sea levels, and the rest we know. If you look at water quality across the world, this is a measure based on SDG 6.3 that focuses on nitrogen and phosphorus, the kinds of runoff you get from agriculture and sewerage. And what we see is that you have problems of water quality in countries rich and poor alike. Look at deforestation rates and look at this little video clip and look at the way it's increasing. Compare deforestation rates pre-COVID to post-COVID, it's roughly 80% higher. Since we are talking about India, may I ask you to look at the map of India and look at the green forests. This is, of course, satellite data, and satellite data as such does not lie. What you will observe is that India's forest frontier has receded dramatically, and now the major forests that you have in India are all in the hill or the mountainous districts where agriculture is very difficult, which is why you don't see those red dots of deforestation in India. A lot of it has happened already. And if we look at air pollution, of course, it is a problem throughout the world. Now, to drill down very, very quickly into India, the Lancet Commission tells us that every year we lose roughly 1.7 million people to deaths caused by air pollution. The deaths caused by coal-fired power stations claim on average twice as many people than is the global number. And of course, it's much, much worse with the older coal-fired power stations and those that use the dirtier coal. And when it comes to water quality, we of course know that nitrogen is very, very important as a fertilizer, but we also know it's heavily subsidized, heavily overused to the extent to which it might be impeding rather than helping yields. And what is still worse is we know that nitrogen in water is implicated in stunting. On average in India, the estimates, the econometrics suggests that women on average have lost 2 centimeters of the height gain. That's about 50 centimeters of the height gain since independence. And of course, water quantity, we know, is a very big problem. Add to that, of course, the fact that even as the world has become richer pre-COVID, income and wealth has diverged. And as you can see in the yellow for India, it is no exception to that trend. So then it is reasonable to ask, is there a better way? Or is all growth, all economic progress always going to cause pollution, climate change, environmental degradation, and greater inequality? Is there a better way out? And it was because of this that the World Bank about a year or so ago, about 6 months ago, came up with this concept of a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery and development. It goes with the acronym GRID, standing for Green, Resilient, and Inclusive Development. And what this is about is really recognizing the fact that the economy is embedded in the environment and that the people, the planet, and the economy are all interdependent. You lose or you forget about one aspect of the link and everything else begins to go wrong. We have unbalanced growth, and what we want is a more balanced growth that recognizes that the depletion of natural capital will spill over to human capital and the rest of the economy. So if we want a better future, as we go forward, we need growth, but we need growth that is resilient. Why resilient? Because we are facing multiple threats, not just climate change. There's the fiscal threats, there's the financial threats that Amar spoke about, and a myriad other threats such as locusts or whatever else, wherever you might be. We need that growth to be inclusive. We don't want growth that only raises the big yachts and leaves the small boats behind, because we know that causes all sorts of problems. We need the growth also to be sustainable, because if it's not sustainable, if it erodes natural capital, we know we're not getting the quality or the type of growth that we want. Also, we want our growth path to be highly efficient for two reasons. One, we know that countries are going to go into greater debt. So you need to make every penny count. And indeed, as you go into more debt, you also need to make sure that you don't hurt yourself tomorrow when you're more indebted. That, of course, is what economics tells us. So with higher debt and with COVID, sustainability is more important, not less important, and therefore we need the efficiency. So let me conclude with this slide with three key takeaway messages. We need to recognize, especially given the dangers that we face with climate change and everything else that we have seen, that the economy is not separate from, is dependent upon, and embedded within nature and the biosphere. We also need to recognize, especially as economists, that not every impact can necessarily be monetized, or indeed easily monetized or monetized at all. That doesn't mean that there are no spillover effects, that there are no trade-offs, and that there are no impacts, which work, of course, both ways. And then thirdly, and finally, let me end with this, and many people fall into this trap, is just because something costs more, it does not mean there's a trade-off, and it does not mean it is not worth doing. It is only not worth doing and a trade-off if the benefits do not outweigh the costs. So if the benefits, say, for example, of cleaning the air, outweigh the costs in terms of deaths, this is surely something that is worth doing. Just because it costs more doesn't mean that we should not do it. With that, let me end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard, for that very compelling intervention. We'll come back to some of the implications in the next round. But if I could now turn to Jean Pisani-Ferry. He's a professor of economics with Sciences Po, Paris, and the Hershey School of Governance in Berlin. And he holds the Tommaso Padua Scioppa Chair of the European Institute in Florence. That footprint is very appropriate since he's the founding director of Bruegel, the European think tank. He has had very, very important positions in France, including as Emmanuel Macron's presidential bid as director of programs and ideas. He is, I know from personal experience, extremely connected to the transatlantic discussions, and there's not one area where Jean Pisani-Ferry has not been active. So with that, Jean, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. I don't deserve such an introduction, but I'm very pleased to be back at ICRIER, if only virtually. I'd like to sort of follow up in a way directly from what Richard just said when he said it's not because it's costly that you shouldn't do it, and discuss precisely the question of the cost of climate change or climate change mitigation. The discussion is, taking shape, and there are really two views of what climate change mitigation entails. One is that it's a sort of change of trajectory that can be smooth, and that can actually lead to improvements, not only in terms of climate, but also economic improvement because new technologies are going to become available. The direction of technical progress is going to change because precisely on technical progress is going to be directed towards greener technologies. And that's going to be a process that in the end will end with us having, a better life at minimum economic cost. The other way of thinking about it is to look at it as a sort of sharp turnaround that implies slowing the speed of your car because it's a sharp turnaround, and that's very much the debate. If we look at the long term, I think we have very good reasons to be more optimistic than what we were a few years ago, let's say 5 or 10 years ago. What we have seen across the board is a collapse of the cost of the green technologies. So I here have some numbers for wind, for batteries, for solar. This is absolutely spectacular. And that was not really expected 5 or 10 years ago. So doesn't mean every part of the decarbonization is going to be easy. Agriculture, for example, is going to be difficult for reasons that have to do with biology. But across a whole range of transformations, the perspective looks much more feasible, much less impossible than it was. And markets have noticed. If you look at the returns on green and brown technologies for energy, the returns of green technologies have now spectacularly exceeded for the last 5 years the return on brown technologies. This is from an IEA Imperial College study on the basis of some 500 fossil fuel companies and 200 renewable companies. So this is a large sample, and it tells you that markets are really considering that the future is renewable. Now, clearly, that doesn't mean that we are on track because the carbon intensity of our GDP is not decreasing as it should be, and the total emissions are still on the increase. I was in a panel with Mike Spence recently, and this is from him, that the net zero implies lowering carbon intensity of GDP by 7% per year. So this is really a major task ahead. Now, Europe has committed itself to doing it, to a major acceleration of emission reduction. On the left, you have the European emissions, the historical emissions of Europe, essentially rising with the post-war recovery until the oil shock, then basically being flat and starting to decrease somewhat in the 90s and the 2000s, especially the 2000s. Part of which actually comes from the offshoring of carbon-intensive industry to other places. So the carbon content of consumption has not decreased in the same way. Now, if you look at the right, that's what the EU is committing itself to. And as you can see, there is ahead a significant acceleration of the pace of decarbonization, including by 2030, up until very recently, the goal for 2030 was significantly less ambitious. So acceleration was supposed to be taking place sometime down the road. But now the acceleration is for the years to come. Now, what does it imply? And the point I'd like to make is that this acceleration changes the perspective on climate change mitigation. For a very long time, climate change was regarded as an issue to be tackled the day after tomorrow. So it was not part of the macro horizon. It was not part of the macro perspective. It was part of the long-term perspective. And so it was not factored in by institutions like treasuries, central banks. international organizations like the IMF or the OECD, this was not factored in the immediate perspectives. It was regarded as something that, oh yes, we need to do for the long term. And what the kind of perspective we're speaking of, as I'm showing this graph on the EU, indicates is that it's becoming an issue for the immediate future. So this extraordinary acceleration has profound implication and turns climate change mitigation into a macro issue. Now, what does that mean? There are many ways in which you can try to figure out what it implies. And there have been scenarios of various sorts. My comparison is that I went back to the price because clearly climate change mitigation is not going to take place exclusively through price instruments, perhaps not mainly through price instruments. There are many reasons why governments are reluctant and citizens are reluctant to relying on the price instrument. But whatever way it is done, through regulatory instrument or through subsidies or through prices, etc., there is a sort of at least a shadow price that indicates what is the way you're pricing this externality on carbon. So if you're setting a quantity objective, that's basically the dual of a price tag. And so it's also, I think, appropriate to reason in terms of prices. And the great advantage is that it gives you something that's commensurate to, the macroeconomy. Here I looked at various estimates of the price for the world. So the IMF says the current price of carbon is $3 per ton. There are the studies indicating that it would be closer to $10 per ton, taking into account all other ways in which carbon is taxed, or fossil fuels are taxed, or de-taxed in some cases with subsidies. And this is to be compared, if we take, let's say, $10 to what various studies have estimated to be the appropriate target price for 2030. Stiglitz-Stern say $75, but there are much higher estimates like the NGFS or the Bank of England or a French official government report that put it closer to $200 per ton or more. Now, let's take the Stiglitz-Stern number and multiply by the total emissions of the world economy. We're getting something that's about 3% of world GDP. And the question is, is it big? Well, a comparison is that the first oil shock was 3.6% of world GDP. So that tells you something about the magnitude of what we're facing. So there are many ways in which decarbonization is different from the oil shock. It's certainly not as sudden. It doesn't imply the same type of international distributional consequences. The ability of our economies to adapt is much stronger. We're better prepared because we know that it's coming. And so technology have become more available. So I'm not saying it will be the same. What I'm saying is that, we're speaking of an order of magnitude that's significant. Now, if we look at the distribution of the burden, the curve on the x-axis, you have GDP per capita, and the y-axis, how much it would imply, considering that the current emission would be valued everywhere at this $75 per ton. You see this sort of inverted U curve, which indicate that poor countries emit very, very little, rich countries emit relatively little, and so in the middle, you have emerging countries that are still reliant on fossil fuels, for which the shock is going to be larger. So again, assuming, and it's too simple, that the same price would apply everywhere. I'm not saying this is what should be done. It's just saying that, to get a sense of the magnitude of the shock. So it's a macro phenomenon with consequences as a negative supply shock for the capital stock. This means part of the existing capital stock will be prematurely obsolete, will have to be put aside, discarded, with consequences for potential output. This has consequences, this has inflationary consequences one way or another, even if it's not priced explicitly. There will be also the consequences of this supply shock. This has distributional consequences, this has public finance consequences, and as investment will need to be stepped in, and I'm going to show some numbers, it's going to also have implication for the distribution of GDP between consumption and investment, so more investment, so in the short term at least, and compared to business as usual, less welfare than traditionally. If I look at the distributional consequences and the macro and distributional consequences, there is a recent paper by Diego Cansec, interesting because he looked at the UK and the consequences. He can identify shocks to the emission trading market, the European emission trading markets, to which the UK was part of, and so identify this shock through regulatory changes and assess what are the macro consequences. And what he finds is that there are significant macro consequences represented on this graph, especially industrial production down, unemployment rate up. So this is not trivial for a shock to the price of energy that corresponds to an increase of 1%. And there are also distributional consequences for different categories of workers and households, and the so lower segments of the distributions are likely to be more affected, both directly because they consume more of an energy-intensive product, because they work more often in energy-intensive sectors, and because they're more affected by the macro consequences of having a demand-side shock that could be negative. So these distributional consequences obviously are something that governments will need to address. And this is a very significant part of the discussion that's ongoing in European countries as a consequence of this plan. Now, as I said, some implications for investment before I close. So how much investment, how much additional investment do we need? There are a number of estimates by the IEA, by the IMF, by the European Commission, by the UK Climate Change Commission. And basically they converge to consider that the amount of additional investment that will be needed by 2030, probably increasing gradually up until 2030 and then staying at this level or starting to decrease, will be of the order of magnitude of 2% of GDP. Again, this is a significant macro number. 2% of GDP, the world investment rate has decreased over the last decades by less than 2% of global GDP. So that would reverse, more than reverse the trend in the global investment rate, with potential consequences for the saving investment balance globally, and therefore for the equilibrium interest rate. So before closing, a word on public finances. The traditional view was that it's good for public finances because a Pigouvian taxation, a taxation of carbon, will yield revenues, and that you will be able, or governments will be able to use these revenues to lower other taxes, taxes on labor or taxes on business, and therefore that they will be a sort of a plus. Even we spoke of double dividend, the dividend of reducing emissions and of reducing the taxation of labor, so improving employment, for example. But that was a view that is difficult to reconcile with the reality as we are seeing it developing. What we're seeing is that there is much more reliance on regulatory measures rather than pricing. There is much more reliance on subsidies, that the public investment component is significant, and that most likely they will need to be transferred to offset the consequences for the most vulnerable households. Meaning that on the whole, the consequence for public finances are unlikely to be positive. Recent Bruegel study estimates the public investment component, only the public investment of the decarbonization agenda, as something between 0.5 and 1% of GDP annually. So not impossible to do, but not a trivial number either. To conclude, so if I compare to where we were 5 or 10 years ago, it's less of an impossible task. So on the one hand, I think we can be more optimistic about the feasibility of greening the economy because technologies have proved to become available that are very cost effective. At the same time, it's also much more urgent, and therefore action has to be faster, has to be more comprehensive. And therefore a number of costs or difficulties that could be spread out over a longer period of time have to be concentrated in time. So that's the paradox what we're facing, easier from a long-term perspective, more demanding from a sort of macro perspective. And again, what's interesting, I think, if we start discussing in detail what these type of policies will entail, I think definitely there is a supply shock. There will be an investment shock. There will be a reallocation shock for labor and capital from sectors to other sectors, from firms to other firms, from occupations to other occupations. And there will be inevitably also a trade shock as a consequence of these policies, but that's something I haven't addressed. We may go back to it in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. We'll come back indeed to some of those points. If I can now switch to our last panelist, and that is Ulka Kelkar. She is the director of the climate program at WRI India, so very much on the ground with 2 decades of experience in climate change research and capacity building and outreach. She leads WRI's India work on climate policy and aims to support India's pathway to a climate resilient, low carbon economy. She has had extensive experience prior to that on climate as a climate assessment specialist at the Asian Development Bank with TERI, with the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology. So very, very well placed to bring particularly an India perspective to the discussion. So Ulka, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amar. I hope you can see my screen. Yes?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much to ICRIER. This is the 3rd time that you've kindly invited me to speak in your G20 conference, and congratulations on your 40th anniversary. Like Jean, I will also take a longer term perspective to this question of why recovery now should set us on a green path rather than the brown path, or as Amar put it, build back better, or in the Indian case, build forward better. I'll start with a global perspective and then turn to focus on India. So this is sort of a result from a recent report by my colleagues in WRI Washington, DC, where they've tried to look at the scenarios based on the current announced pledges of different countries. So the red path tells us basically, what we are sort of headed for, 2.8 degrees Celsius, based on policies, pledges that are currently in progress. The orange one is pledges that have been committed very recently, which is these 2030 targets, nationally determined contributions as we call them. Some countries have updated them. The yellow part takes us to where we add things like the United States net zero pledge for 2050, which is announced but not yet enacted into law or policy. And the green is what if everyone, all the G20 countries, were to do a little better and enhance their ambition. But all of this doesn't take us to 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So in some sense, maybe by the end of COP26, just a month from now, we will be somewhere compliant with the 2.1 degrees Celsius pathway. So not all is not lost, much more optimistic than what the IPCC warned us in August, where they said that their best estimate was 3 degrees Celsius, but still a lot of work ahead of us to realize what is possible. With this, I'll come to the Indian case. What is it that India can do? And basically, this is work in progress that my colleagues at WRI India have been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. And I'll try to answer the question that was posed to us by the conference organizers. That is it possible to have a recovery that is green, resilient, and inclusive, all three at once? And I'm fairly confident that it can be 2 of these 3. So I will show you numbers, modeling analysis, which shows a green and resilient economy. But about the inclusive part, as Jean pointed out when he spoke about the distributional effects and the shocks, we will need additional policies to make sure that happens. So I'm using something called the Energy Policy Simulator tool, which has been developed by a company called Energy Innovation LLC. It's all open source. It's a systems dynamics model. You can go to this website and look at it. And we carried out a number of expert consultations in the last few years, trying to just see whether the assumptions and scenarios that we're using make sense. These are what-if scenarios, they're not forecasts. We have different policy lever settings. The model tries to optimize costs in the electricity sector and the transport sector. It's assuming that technology costs are falling, perhaps not as rapidly as we all hope they will fall. Basically these are the constant prices everywhere for 2018. So we've tried to create 4 different scenarios. In the reference scenario, the black one, you can see the dip in 2020, which is the impact of the COVID-induced recession. But then we are back to a rising emissions trajectory for India. So no peaking in sight in the reference scenario. And this is not a do-nothing scenario. It's not a no-action scenario. As I'll show you on the next slide, it has a healthy amount of renewable energy and electric mobility in it. Then we have this blue scenario where we don't have climate change or deep decarbonization as a goal, but we are basically trying to meet the unmet energy needs of the Indian population. So what are our SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, and what are the relevant NDC targets and how can we meet those? So that's the blue scenario, better than the reference scenario, definitely, but certainly not what people would call a decarbonization scenario. In the SDG NDC linkages scenario, it's a slightly short-term thinking. You're trying to meet the SDGs by 2030, but you're not taking a longer-term perspective going forward to 2040 and 2050. The green one, which is a long-term decarbonization scenario, tries to do just that. And I'll show you on the next slide some of the new types of policy levers that need to kick in, the new kinds of technologies that need to become available at low cost. And finally, there's this thought experiment of what if you were trying to do a deep decarbonization, maybe try to aim for net zero 2050. In this case, we're talking about CO2. We're not assuming carbon capture and storage, so you can see the residual emissions that would need to be removed from the atmosphere. And with this, let me just try to point out what are the big policy levers. The biggest one is not in the power sector, it's in the industry sector. And it is that the use of fossil fuels in industry needs to switch to electrification and to hydrogen. And we're assuming 50% in the long-term decarbonization scenario and 80% in the deep decarbonization scenario. This hydrogen needs to come from clean electricity. It needs to be produced from electrolysis. It needs to be green hydrogen, so 100% of that. Otherwise, you'll just get a penalty. You need a carbon tax, no surprise. These are not very high levels of carbon taxes. With all of these policy settings, the numbers that I'm showing here are the intended targets for 2050. And we are linearly increasing them, mostly starting in 2020 as for the carbon tax. But for the electrification and hydrogen lever, for example, anything that requires a huge amount of technology that is currently in the nascent R&D stage, it kicks in 2025 or 2030. So we have a modest carbon tax, electric vehicle sales mandate. You would have heard that there's already a lot going on in India, so we accelerate that in the more ambitious scenarios. Material efficiency, so not industrial energy efficiency, but material efficiency, which you might call circular economy. This is a very powerful lever because even if you were to clean up all your electricity, there is no substitute for the process emissions that arise in the cement and iron and steel sector right now. Also, it has a potentially negative effect on the economy because you're basically depressing the demand for these goods. So GDP and jobs might get adversely affected. So this is an important lever to watch out for. And then finally, we have this thing called carbon-free electricity standards, which is basically a renewable energy purchase mandate. We have a lot of it, as you can see in the reference scenario, and it's sort of going up in the deeper decarbonization scenarios as well. So if you have a minimum mandate of 80%, with cost optimization, the model gives you 99% of renewable energy by 2050. So as you can see, just as with CO2 emissions, similarly with air pollution and health effects, all the, the sort of the more ambitious scenarios are way better than the reference scenarios. So this kind of climate action is definitely good for health. It is also good for our import bill. India depends heavily on imported petroleum, crude oil, and as you can see over here as well, as we switch away from these and adopt more renewable energy, the energy or import expenditure goes down significantly in the climate action scenarios compared to the reference scenario. Change in jobs. Now, because this is a systems dynamic, it's not a very sophisticated model. We are using pretty basic input-output model data. We have not kind of done anything very sophisticated with it. But the important thing is that even with all this climate action, you have a positive impact on the jobs as well. However, the caveat over here is that this is more than direct jobs created in things like renewable energy, in electric mobility. In fact, you may create jobs in the electric vehicle sector, but you may reduce jobs in the internal combustion engine vehicle sector or in vehicle repair and maintenance, for example. As I mentioned earlier, even with material efficiency, the effect on jobs can be potentially negative. So what I'm showing you over here is direct jobs, indirect jobs from the supply chains, and a large effect of induced jobs. So retail, tourism, travel, agriculture, even food, all of this goes up as the revenue, as the income, from these direct and indirect job increases is re-spent by households. The other effect over here, as I will show you, is that of the carbon tax. Now, on the the lower half of this chart, you're seeing that as fossil fuel share in total primary energy consumption falls from around 70% to 20%, fossil fuel tax revenue goes down. And for the Indian government, fossil fuel tax revenue is about 25% of their total tax revenue. So this is important. So carbon tax is important, not just to incentivize shifts in the economy, but also to put in the hands of the government the revenue that it needs to make the kinds of investments in human capital that Richard spoke about, health, education, all of that. So the carbon tax, it's important to make sure that it is recycled correctly, but it does have this very valuable role of substituting or of compensating for the loss of fossil fuel tax revenue and for stimulating induced jobs in the economy as well as money is, as spent. So I think that's basically what I wanted to present today. I wanted to end with 3 points. One is we will need massive investments. I've not presented the cost numbers. The workforce transition will really have to be managed because what I presented are aggregate numbers, not what it means for specific regions of the Indian economy. And finally, the government revenue, I cannot stress enough that the kinds of distributional effects that Jean spoke about, something that will be very important for India. And we will have to make sure that we have the right kinds of policies and safety nets in place. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulka, for that very insightful presentation and giving a very, anchored India perspective. So in the next round, what I'd like to do is build, based on these really excellent presentations, pose 4 questions. And they are somewhat matching what each of you presented, but feel free as you respond to kind of weigh in on any particular aspects. So I want to begin with the centrality and the challenge of investment. So as Jean mentioned, globally, the orders of magnitude are 2%. The numbers for emerging markets and developing countries, including India, is larger. And the reason for that is the energy transition is overlaid on the development transition. It's not that, as Ulka pointed out. So if you look at it, over the next 3 decades, the world population will increase by 2 billion, all of it in emerging markets and developing countries other than China. And with that also, there is a development challenge, because although Richard pointed out that we've made great progress, the wealth numbers that he was talking about in terms of capital, physical, social, and human capital in particular, in the emerging markets and developing countries is 1/20th of that of the advanced economies. So these next 3 decades will be a very important period of convergence. And with that, there will be big development needs. And on top of that, you have these kind of growing environmental constraints that Richard talked about. So the answer to this, of course, is a better investment and making those investments early on. So how do we do that? What will it take to unlock the scale of investments that are necessary? And what are the implications in terms of financing? If your thoughts on that would be very welcome. The second point I want to build on is essentially around transition costs. Okay, so Jean suggested that there are a number of shocks that we have to anticipate. Now, in the case, a very specific shock in the case of India, for example, is the phase out of coal, because that will accelerated phase out of coal will be a tremendous cost for those countries like India or China or South Africa that are very heavily invested in coal, and the coal-fired power plants may not be as old as in advanced economies. So how does one manage transition costs? On the other side, I also want to ask the question, are we overplaying the transition costs? Jean talked about the different types of costs we will face, but there are some opportunities as well. And let me just flag a few. The first is a lot of the capital stock in advanced economies is aging and polluting. There is an opportunity to replace it by better, more efficient capital. I don't see why that's a cost. The case for infrastructure spending in the United States long predates the climate debate. Second, in emerging markets and developing countries, most of the capital stock is new capital stock. 80% of the infrastructure that we will have in 2050 has yet to be built. So emerging markets and developing countries has a tremendous opportunity to leapfrog. There are tremendous dynamic gains in it. And the third thing Jean didn't talk about are co-benefits that Richard mentioned. There are tremendous co-benefits here that can be tapped. And the final point, more from an endogenous growth point of view, is there are dynamics. The technological changes that we are putting in place are going to be path dependent, but they could have very, very powerful dynamic effects. So a macro question to you, Jean, is are those being sufficiently factored in to the discussion? And the last point I want to make is around, given that this is a conference of the G20, what are the benefits of acting together? We know, from a macro point of view, for example, if you want to pursue recovery, acting together has tremendous externalities in a Keynesian sense, but also on the supply sense. If you act together, you can set common expectations. For example, if all countries in the G20 agreed on phase out of internal combustion engines by, let's say, 2030 or zero power by 2040, it will set a very powerful signals on expectations for the private sector drive investment. And the last point I just want to close on, again, is, coming back to Jean's point about, the investment conundrum and starting, there are, we are not in a world of excess investment, we are in a world of excess savings. We have 400 trillion of, in institutional capital sitting around not earning very much, okay? Isn't this the space to deploy that? And particularly when you think about most of the demand being in the South, there's also a big gain in terms of the demographic dividend, in terms of investment of savers in more productive investments in the South. So some of these points, I think, are worth going a little bit more into. As I said, please take your pick, but if we could have a second round of responses from you, maybe just about 3-4 minutes each. So I'll begin in the same order, starting with you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Amar. Your questions go to the very heart of everything. So let me try to answer all of them, but not necessarily in the order that you place. So your first question, in terms of the investment needs, roughly 2-3% GDP, there's many numbers around. And a lot of it is needed in EMDBs. I want to link that to your last question. So to invest, we need funds. And we often elide the distinction between financial constraints and funding constraints and debt. So we're in a situation, as you mentioned, where we have an excess of savings and surpluses in the private sector and vast deficits that are reflected almost as a necessity in equilibrium in the public sector and public sector debt. And of course, the obvious strategy or remedy would be to try to attract and leverage some of that private sector money into the public sector. So the question you need to ask yourself is a foundational one. So why, if you're looking for the most meager of returns in the private sector, will you not come in and invest in these sorts of things that we know are overall good for the economy, good for people, good for human capital, et cetera, et cetera? And one of the answers is that the playing field, the investment playing field and the incentives are entirely tilted towards not investing in these things. Country after country subsidize fossil fuels either implicitly or explicitly. Country after country will subsidize overuse and abuse of natural resources rather than pricing them appropriately, and so on and so forth. Little wonder then that the private sector, when it invests in depleting stocks of natural capital rather than augmenting and investing in it. And as long as that continues, this vicious cycle will continue, and you will continue to get mounting savings in one sector and mounting deficits in another sector that is trying to plug the gap of the damage that is done or the underinvestment that is done. So without getting to the core of the incentives, you're not going to shift that risk-reward framework that we have, or that balance of risk and reward that we have. We reward doing the wrong things rather than the right things. And then to get to your second question on the transition costs, and of course we know incentives work. We provide the incentives and we see green technologies becoming reasonably competitive. But while accepting your arguments about the dynamic gains, there's also the urgency of the here and now. And I think we shouldn't understate some of the costs of the transition out of fossil fuels. To take the longer view, the longer trajectory, ever since we humans emerged from the cave, or before we got to the caves, we've been burning fossil fuels for development, for growth, for where we actually are. So to have that transition away from fossil fuels is quite a big move in terms of all the infrastructure that we have. And as Ulka pointed out, there are some technologies that simply don't exist, like cement. How do we produce clean cement? We don't know how to do that in a reasonably good way. That's reasonably benign. So these are some pretty big issues that one will have to grapple with. Another very big issue in terms of the transition costs that we have to grapple with is the food system. There's been a number of estimates, but they all roughly converge on something like this. But if you take the health costs, the environmental costs, the externalities, the inefficiencies of the food production system, in other words, the non-marketed costs, the externalities, roughly the food system costs 2 trillion more than it yields in terms of benefits. Yet we cannot live without the food system. So that is another major challenge that no one has actually spoken about over here, where unless we change diets, it is very, very feasible we're not going to get out of these problems. If you look at the world right now, if you look at India, for example, a lot of the rice in India, the rice is water thirsty, is produced in the driest parts of India, rather than, say, the West, which has a natural comparative advantage. If you look at other countries of the world, you will see that lettuce is grown in the deserts and exported to wet regions. So the incentives are all almost exactly the opposite of what you would desire. And therefore, the transition will become more expensive because of what we have. And then your final point, which was your third question, of acting together. Let me give another flavor of this. What we do know is that if the majority of the world did start acting together, and you were in what game theorists call a more cooperative equilibrium, the costs of the transition come down very, very, very dramatically. You know, to take a very obvious example, if no one is buying things that are fossil fuel intensive, something like, I'm not saying we should have it, but something like the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, then suddenly this shifts incentives in countries that are very, very carbon intensive to do different things. So we know from a lot of the modeling that's been done is that the costs of mitigation under cooperative strategies are very, very much lower. And this is sort of game theory 101 we've known for a very long time. Where we have a little bit of a research weakness, this is going to be my last point, I think it's in terms of how we actually go from the current equilibrium, the Paris Agreement, which is more like a Nash equilibrium, to one which is more cooperative. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Jean?
Well, Richard said many things I agree with. So it's a few compliments, starting with the benefits of acting together. I think they're extremely strong. There's clearly the question of incentives. So we know that because climate action involves so many externalities, without acting together, you're always facing the risk, of government choosing free riding on the efforts by the others. But with it come three additional benefits of acting together. One is the credibility of action. And I think that's fundamental because if climate action is not credible, that means companies will hesitate between investing in the technologies of yesterday and investing in the technologies of tomorrow. And that's somehow the worst of both worlds. You don't know, and since you don't know, you don't invest. So any progress on the climate front is much more costly if you're in a framework in which your action is not credible. And we know that the Paris Agreement has been quite successful in creating a momentum. So there is credibility of joint action. As I showed you, the market believes in the renewables. You could look also at the valuation of car producers and the direction of private investment. All that indicates that there is credibility, but this is extremely fragile. Assume that the consequence from Glasgow would be that the impression would be that China and the US are just not able to agree on climate because they're not able to agree on anything else. And so you could still see the fragile global momentum and insufficient momentum that was very clearly shown in the slides of Ulka. I mean, that was important. You could see this momentum unraveling. So I think credibility is one. Technical progress is another one. And I think on what you said, also in your remarks on transition costs, the question of the pace of technical progress and the way in which developing countries may leapfrog and benefit from technical progress triggered by climate action is fundamental. Because I mean, you in a way, you corrected me, and rightly so, when I said the burden can be higher because they are more carbon-intensive economies, right? But at the same time, there are economies that have to build their capital stock, and that economies that therefore can suffer less from the obsolescence of the existing capital stock and more from the possibility of building a capital stock on the basis of new and greener technologies. So this is a major spillover effect that's positive for developing economy. And I would say the last one perhaps is that joint action facilitates all the difficulties we're going to face with trade. Those difficulties are in a way unavoidable because we're not going to proceed at the same speed, we're not going to price carbon in the same way. Heterogeneity is going to be there. But if this heterogeneity is contained, the spillover onto trade will be also limited. And there can be, border adjustment measures that are compatible not only with the letter, but with the spirit of the WTO rules, and that do not disrupt trade. But obviously, if we go on the alternative for the extreme situation in which some countries are going very fast towards decarbonization and some other countries do nothing, it's going to be very hard to avoid spillover onto a negative spillover onto trade. Because the first will necessarily try to protect their producer and avoid leakages, and the second would say, well, you're doing that, it's protectionist in disguise. So I think that's also important in this regard. The last point on your excess saving, basically what you're saying, I think, and I think that's right, that one of the consequences from this transition is going to be more significant capital flows going from north to south. I mean, that's needed because the investment needs will be there, and the savings are still mostly in advanced countries. So there will be also implication for global saving investment flows. So that which is again a macro issue.
Entirely, thank you, and thank you very much for bringing out the point, especially with the discussions on CBAM right now on the trade dimension. I think that will be another important consequence if we move unevenly. Ulka, let me turn to you, and then I'd like to take a few questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll take your first two questions in reverse order. So to start by talking about some of the transition costs by giving 3 examples, and then come to 3 ways to unlock the scale of investments required. I think on transition costs, you're right in saying, all of this should sort of pay for itself. It makes sense. But there are 3 examples I wanted to give of why this doesn't quite play out in a country like India. For example, the opportunities for energy efficiency improvement are massive right now, but they're all located in the informal sector, in MSMEs, which don't have the time or the capacity to access the finance that's even already available, and to access technologies that are currently available. The problem is that the costs are upfront, the fuel savings, the climate benefits, the health benefits all accrue over the time period of decades. So no one really has the incentive to break this kind of puzzle of the timing. The second example I wanted to give was the issue of land, which we don't always factor in the transition costs. So for example, for the scale of renewable energy required in India, solar and wind, there's a recent study which estimates that we require 20 to 30,000 square kilometers of land. That's 2 to 3% of India's non-forested land. Who owns this land? And how will we compensate them? What will they do for their livelihoods after that? All of this is an important issue. The third example I wanted to give was, like, what is the transition? For example, in the context of cooking, 2/3 of women in India are still using firewood for cooking. There is, as you know, a policy to replace firewood with a liquefied petroleum gas, LPG. But the ultimate transition has to be to switch to electrification, to electrify appliances, and to make that electricity come from renewables. Who is investing in giving clean cooking for rural Indian households in the form of induction stoves? So I don't have the answers to this. I'm countering your questions with my own, but I will end with 3 positive examples of the unlocking the finance. I mean, just as you very rightly said, we have savings, and the pension funds and long-term investors are really looking at the same time scale of 2030, 2040, 2050 that climate change researchers are, unlike other economists, in our country. So I think that's a very potential source of finance, provided that they get that sense of regulatory certainty, the long-term direction of travel. So there, I think a G20 solidarity kind of announcement would really help to provide that signal. On the climate finance fund, as it flows through the UNFCCC channels, it's a big disappointment, as you know, and it's creating the issue of climate debt for least developed countries. Because a lot of the money that's coming to them as climate finance is loans, it's not grants. So they're becoming more indebted as they try to cope with climate change. But I'd like to end with the power of government mandates to create demand. We all know the story of LED lighting in India, how the government sort of acted as an aggregator. We've seen the Joe Biden administration talk about standards or mandates for low carbon building materials, which can create a demand, create a market for low carbon steel. And in India, there is talk about aggregating the demand for green hydrogen from across different industrial sectors like fertilizer or steel. So I think that is going to be quite key to providing the regulatory certainty, to de-risking some of these investments and aggregating the demand that is needed to unlock the scale of finances that's required. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ulka. So we don't have much time. I have in the chat box, I see 2 questions. And if the organizers see any others, please flag them. So I'm just going to read them out, and then whichever one of you wants to respond. So the first one is, should the polluter pay principle, say a green tax, be applied to the polluting industrial units in India to combat the menace of industrial emissions and put India on the path of sustainable growth? And that comes from Kanupriya. And then there's another question from the floor. We talked about whether recovery can be resilient, green, and inclusive. It seems we forgot to add a 4th dimension, affordability. And if we can't pay for it fully, which of the objectives is most likely to be shortchanged? Is it inclusiveness, as Ulka hinted? Should we be thinking of sequencing the objectives rather than trying to achieve them all at once? And that, I think, is a fundamental question, which is, are these, the grid objectives, as Richard mentioned, really complementary, or are there trade-offs? So let me end with that, open it back to you. And if you have any one-liner that you want us to take away, please close with that. So back to you, Richard.
Let me focus on the first question a little bit more, the polluter pays principle. Of course, we know that in economics, having a standard tax is a very good thing, but we know in the real world, there's often lots of objections to that. People don't like paying taxes, which is why there's very many more regulations that we see around the world. But to the extent to which, of course, you can implement a polluter pays principle, it's probably not a bad thing, but it's probably not going to suffice on its own. If we're thinking, for example, of carbon taxes, let's take the very obvious case. We can double, triple, quadruple the carbon tax, and you want people to stop using, say, their cars, unless you can provide them with an alternative, be it public transport or electric vehicle or something else. You know what? People will still keep using their cars. So we need complementary policies as well. But of course, incentives are very, very powerful. On the issue of affordability, of course, it's correct. Everything really needs to be affordable. What we're, I think, talking about when we're talking about the grid is to lift your gaze from looking very, very narrowly at looking at the broader objectives of development. Let me put it another way. What we are saying is that economic development is about more than a single statistic, whatever it is, that statistic of your choice. There is things like this, the inclusion, the sustainability, the health of your population, et cetera, that you need to be very, very mindful of. And once you begin to think in those terms, it becomes less a matter of this or that or affordable or not affordable. It becomes much more a matter of a balanced growth path and a balanced development path. Put very, very simply, you wouldn't want development which simply consists of building flyover bridges across all your cities and saying your transport problem is solved. You need to be much more balanced as to what the options are. And it's simply no different over here. I hope that's partially answered that very good question, or both of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Jean?
Question of affordability is a very good question, is a very important one. If we are taking this 2% of GDP number, and let's be very simple. Let's assume we're doing it for 10 years. We're speaking of 20% of GDP. And then assume that there's not going to be additional growth because if you assume that output is at its potential, or even a little bit below its potential, and then you have the supply side effects of this, accelerated depreciation of the existing capital, which is a negative for the potential output. So basically, assuming that output is constant is a relatively optimistic assumption, at least for the medium term. And so you're saying, I'm going to invest 20% more in order basically to get the same output, the same level of output. So this is a significant levy on current income. And depending on who is paying for it, it's going to have different consequences. So first question is, can it be postponed to future generations? Can future generations pay part of it? From an equity standpoint, I would say in some cases it's highly disputable. In some other cases, it's more, it's more reasonable to assume that you can spread the cost over generations. And then you have the political economy question, which is if you want to act and current generations are reluctant to pay the price for it, then you may in the end prefer to sort of pass part of the burden to future generations. Now the question is, can you actually go into debt? And there can be issues of sustainability of your current debt level, and that's an issue for some advanced countries. There can be the issue of access to saving. That can be an issue for developing and emerging countries. So that's the whole question of debt. Now you have the question of taxes. Who should pay for it? And I think inevitably this climate issue is going to reopen the income distribution debate, or to heighten the existing income distribution debate, because we're all confronted to a sort of vital threat for mankind. And the question of who is able to pay, and therefore who should be paying for the cost of tackling this problem is unavoidable. So it's my sort of analogy is with increasing your war effort, your preparedness in terms of facing potential external threats. That's something you may have no choice to do. And indeed, that's the best way of guaranteeing the welfare of your citizens. If you're can sort of ward off a potential threat by investing into defense. And then it raises the question of who should be paying for it. And in all countries, we know that in this kind of situation, this also has ripple effect on the distributional debate on who should be paying for it. So in a way, that's part of the issue. And finally, there's the issue of transfers, of especially international transfers, which is unavoidable because we simply know that some countries won't have access to the market. They won't be able to tap into the financial markets to finance the transition. They just don't have the revenues needed to do the right level of investment. So inevitably, and from an equity standpoint, you can say that they hardly contributed to the stock. So there is this equity also dimension, which is very hard in terms of the principles, but in some cases, it's not that hard to find out that there is a need for some redistribution across countries. So I think the affordability brings in all these dimensions, and I think that's going to be an important debate in the years to come.
Thank you, Jean. Ulka, you have the last word. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll answer the coal tax question in the sense that you've asked about fossil fuel. Should we have the polluter pays principle? We already had a coal cess, and it was supposed to go into a National Clean Energy Fund, and then that was diverted into a GST compensation fund. So a carbon tax is not a completely new idea. It's already there in our economy. The point is the amount has to be right. It has to be gradually increased. It has to cover more sources of emissions, for example, including process emissions in industry. We need to communicate well why a new tax, what is it going to be used for? We need to think about how it's going to get passed on to final consumers, especially the lower income segments who, as Jean pointed out, use a higher share of their income for energy and basic needs. And finally, how is the revenue going to be recycled? So all of this is important, but even then a carbon tax, however crucial it may be, will not be enough. We will need investments in new infrastructure, in electricity generation, in hydrogen creation, and in electric mobility. So it's not a magic silver bullet, as nothing is in the whole climate change issue. I want to end with just one sentence and connecting back, Amar, to your question about unlocking scale of finance. And I think there was a lot of chatter a few months ago about a minimum corporate tax. And there are moves, there is a sort of willingness to consider this. That can be an important new source of revenue if countries only have the political will to use that minimum corporate tax revenue for sustainable growth. Thanks, back to you, Amar.
Thank you, Ulka. And just to add that with the minimum corporate tax also goes, robust tax avoidance measures, which require international cooperation. And with it also goes international tax equity. At the moment, as you know, there are many, many big companies that pay no taxes. There are proposals to tax them, but most of the benefits would go to the advanced economies. So tax equity is also important. In closing, I just want to make some points which are really strands that we discussed and we did not discuss. So the first thing is, this year, we are likely to see some progress, but as Richard and Jean and Ulka pointed out, that progress is not likely to be enough, and especially the graphs that Ulka put up from the work of the WRI. So what are we seeing? We are seeing a commitment now for the first time, which is a coordinated commitment by the G7 to net zero targets by 2050 and to translate those into targets for 2030 in the range of 45 to 50% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels. It's a big positive step forward. However, in the G20, that agreement did not proceed. And it did not proceed essentially because, actions are still very much considered, centered in some cases quite correctly around issues of burden sharing. In the end, the world has a limited carbon budget. How it is distributed right now as it shrinks is a big issue that has to be tackled. And as Jean pointed out, with it are important distributional issues as well. So I think, on the other hand, one point that I think did not come through from the discussion is the counterfactual is not about, costs. The counterfactual is if we do not act, the costs will be even greater. Okay, so it's not a choice that we have. I don't think any of the panelists suggested that we have the choice of not doing things. The other point I want to make is something that Richard said, which is in the previous growth model, we were not sufficiently valuing the destruction that we were creating with the growth path. And in the new, and that's an important point. So it's absolutely correct what Jean said, that there will be costs that have to be met, but there are also benefits in a counterfactual sense, particularly in the preservation of natural capital, and particularly in the choices for the future. So I think that has to be kept in mind as well. Now, in terms of recovery and transformative growth, we all agree that we will need significant investments. Those investments will have to be funded and they will have to be financed. And I think a point that was made is affordability. In many dimensions that Jean pointed out, I also want to make an additional point, which is the cost of capital. The reality is today that the cost of capital in the world is zero. It might rise a little bit because of the macroeconomic responses that we are seeing, but it will remain very low. However, the cost of borrowing by emerging markets and developing countries, especially for long-term investments, remains very high. And I want to come back to the point, therefore, that Richard mentioned, that there is a very important agenda in bridging that divide through risk mitigation at scale, through unlocking investments and creating better and more predictable structures. At the country level, ultimately, everything will depend on putting in place country-type programs of the kind that Ulka was talking about, especially in a country like India. I thought Montek Singh Ahluwalia's decarbonization paper on India and the work that Ulka cited now is beginning to give us a good basis for discussing, in some sense, the choices that we face in a very country-specific way. I mean, numbers that I'm aware are being generated around investment costs in India, for example, help us then consider what are the financing options. So I think this discussion of recovery, growth, and transformation in the end is less about trade-offs. It's more about specificity of understanding and then what will be the means by which to deliver. The World Bank's grid paper, its climate change action plan, has also altered the debate, but ultimately we will need significant sums of concessional finance as well. And as Ulka pointed out, the delivery of that finance has been disappointing to date. And we have to push collectively, particularly on the advanced countries, to deliver that. So with that, with 2 minutes to spare, I want to give it back to the organizers, saying we have delivered this panel on time, and thanks to the panelists with very high quality. So thank you everybody very much for this discussion. I can assure you this topic will remain very much center stage as we go into the G20 next year under Indonesia. I know that from speaking to the Indonesians, and it will remain very live when India takes the chair of the G20. So thank you very much. Thank you, Deepak, for giving me this opportunity, and to Manmeet and the whole team. Over back to the organizers.
Thank you, Amar, John, Richard, and Ulka for a wonderful discussion and presentation. This was terrific, and finishing on time is great because we have our next set of panelists already connected. So thank you very much, and have a good day for you guys. And if you want to stay around, that'll be wonderful. But if you want to log out and get back to your other stuff in life, you're free to do so. And so now let me turn to the next set of panelists. I don't see Yamini, who would be chairing our session, but I do see Carl, Ulka. Oh, Yamini is here too. Okay, and oh, wonderful, and Alina. So I just wanted to say to folks who have been around, we've been around for about for 90 minutes. So some of you might just like to stretch out for a minute, just get off your seat and stretch out and come back. But we will start as soon as I see Yamini on the screen. I think we have a fairly good understanding of the order and the format we are going. So we could start as soon as she is back. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to just go grab a cup of coffee or just stretch out for a second, you could do that now. Thank you. So friends, just want to tell you that Yamini is connected, but she's in the attendee list and not in the panelist list. So we are trying to move her here. Otherwise, we can't hear her. So it'll take us 30 seconds or 1 minute max. So we'll be back then very soon. Oh, I see her. Okay, yeah, she's terrific. So wonderful. So we have all 4 of you and we can start. We are live. So Yamini, if you're ready, we can go ahead.
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you very much, Deepak and ICRIER for inviting me to chair this really important session. It's an absolute privilege for me to have the opportunity to be part of this dialogue. And as somebody who has spent a vast part of my career slogging over the question of social protection, it is gratifying that we are now actually front and centering this issue in many of our mainstream conversations on the economy. I've always argued that often in our debates on social protection, we've always argued that social protection is, it's an afterthought. It comes first, growth first, and then social protection. And increasingly, and I think COVID has really brought this out in very, very sharp relief, social protection is constitutive of growth, not something that comes sequentially after growth. It's not a privilege of growing economies. It's a necessary element for growth. But of course, the challenges that COVID presented, at least in the Indian scenario vis-a-vis social protection, in many ways represented the challenge, if I may say so, of the 20th century of social protection. There are core questions of the role of the state and the ability of the state to ensure that there's a broad safety net available to all its workers, particularly in economies that tend to be largely in the informal sector. But if you look across the globe, and this is a challenge for India too, not only do we have to address the 20th century challenge of social protection, there's also now the 21st century challenge of social protection that comes from the very significant and creatively disruptive shifts that have taken place in the economy thanks to technology, what we now call industrialization 4.0. as the gig economy flourishes, it in its own way tends to be fundamentally shifts actually relationships between labor and capital, and questions of the role of the state and the role of social protection front and center themselves in a somewhat different way. But the normative question of what is the kind of safety net that needs to be provided, and how do you decommodify labor in a way that labor has a broad has protection, becomes really, really crucial. And it is to discuss some of these issues that we have today a really fantastic panel, and I'm looking forward to listening and learning from all our panelists. Let me very quickly just introduce our panelists before we launch into the conversation. We have with us Carol Benedict Frey, who is the Oxford Martin City Fellow at the University of Oxford, where he directs the program on the future of work. We have also Alina Sogna, who is the Assistant Professor of Applied Data Analytics and the Chair of the Department of Business Administration at John Cabot University in Rome, Italy. And we also have Ruzbe Irani, who is the President, Group Human Resources and Communications since April 2020. He is also responsible for corporate social responsibility and corporate services, and he is a member of the Mahindra Group's executive board. So we have both an academic perspective, a policy perspective, and a private sector perspective to shape our discussions today, and really, really looking forward and excited to learn from our panelists. Let me first call upon Dr. Carl B. Frey to give us a perspective on how the world's labor market is being reshaped by technology.
Thank you, first of all, very much for your kind introduction. Thank you very much, Deepak, for your kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today from Oxford, although I would admittedly have preferred to come and see you in Delhi again. It was a great pleasure to be with you last time pre-COVID, but I think this virtual presentation does sort of remind us of some of the virtues, but also some of the vices of remote work and digitalization, and what that means for the future of work globally. And that is what I would like to share with you today. Now, some of you are probably old enough to remember that we had these debates before, right? Back in the 1990s, a lot of pundits, academics, journalists predicted the death of distance, predicted the end of offices, and predicted a period of convergence. Why, after all, if you can work remotely and interact digitally with the web, which had just arrived, with email that had just arrived, would you choose to cluster in expensive places like Paris and London? After all, if we could work remotely just as well, we might, spread out more evenly and take advantage of all the space that we still have. Now, 30 years down the line, it seems that it did actually take a pandemic for these predictions to come through. And I think the question is why? And in order to answer that question, we need to think more fundamentally about some of the relationships between technological change and agglomeration. And as many economists have pointed out over the years, the reason that we tend to cluster has to do with the cost of moving goods, the cost of moving people, and the cost of moving ideas. Now, since the Industrial Revolution, the railroads, the steamships, air transportation, and so on, the cost of moving goods have declined very dramatically. But over the same period of time, as we all know, urbanization, if anything, has accelerated. So despite the declining cost of moving goods around, cities are alive and thriving like never before. At the same time, even though the world has become more digitized and the cost of moving ideas has declined very rapidly, since the 1990s, we do see that digitization, if anything, seems to have made the world more spiky. Before the computer revolution of the 1980s, we see that new types of work in the United States were spread quite evenly across space, or at least there was no relationship between the share of knowledge workers in a city. Since 1980s, we see that the workforce has become more and more clustered in skilled locations with an abundance of people working in knowledge industries. And perhaps the quintessential example of this is, of course, Silicon Valley, which is at the forefront of digital technology, which, of course, is one of the most clustered places in the world. And if we take an even sort of broader look at history, as Richard Baldwin has shown, these type of costs very much can also explain the wealth and poverty of countries. Before 1820, the age of the railroads, and transportation costs were very high. Consumption and production needed to be very clustered because of the high cost of moving goods around. When we solve that with steamships and railroads, small cities in Britain and Europe could take advantage of that, specialize in innovation, which was still highly clustered, and transport goods to the rest of the world. Something happens then around 1990, which Richard Baldwin called the second unbundling, where ICT technology for the first time actually allows companies in the industrialist world to take advantage of pools of cheap labor in places like Southeast Asia, coordinate production at distance, and as a result, we see a lot of jobs being relocated to places like China, and we see a subsequent decline in global inequality. And as many of you are probably aware, Branko Milanovic has illustrated the patterns of global inequality resulting from this in the following way: the famous elephant figure, where you see at point A, which seems sort of some of the highest cumulative gains in real income are people in countries like China. In point B, you see hardly any income gains, and those are often, manufacturers, cities in the industrial West. And in point C, you see people in, high-skilled and innovative sectors in places like Silicon Valley who have reaped the gains from this shift in technology. And let me just underline that I don't believe that technology is the only factor driving inequality. I don't mean to suggest that at all, but it has been a prime factor. And a key question that many people are asking these days is obviously, can this pattern continue? Because robots and technology is making industrialization harder. It's not as easy any longer for countries to grow rich by simply shifting labor out of agriculture to manufacturing, and because of what Daniel Roderick has called premature industrialization, the fact that manufacturing is becoming less labor intensive. And we can see that even in countries like China, over the past couple of years or so, manufacturing employment has declined, and they lost over 12 million manufacturing jobs over this period. And of course, this is only the past we're looking at. And if we're looking what's going on in technology, you might argue that we have seen nothing yet. In the past, it used to be the case that automation was highly confined to routine rule-based activities in factories that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore be readily automated. What we're seeing now is more of a sort of bottom-up approach to automation through machine learning, where computers increasingly are capable of inferring the rules of the game themselves, and that's led to an expanding scope of tasks that can be automated as a consequence. If you consider, technologies like the Qbot, which has delivered food and medicine in hospitals throughout this pandemic, it's quite easy to specify in advance what the robot should do because it acts in a very structured environment. Conversely, if you want to teach an algorithm to drive a car in city traffic, there's no program in the world that can foresee any given situation you will end up in and specify that in computer code in advance to allow the vehicle to navigate successfully in traffic. The way we're trying to solve this problem is by collecting a lot of data on human drivers and for the algorithms to try to predict what a human person would have done in this situation. Now, there have been a number of studies looking at what the potential impacts of automation on the labor market could be like. And I would suggest that the one thing they do have in common is that they do suggest that it's primarily low-skill, low-income jobs that are exposed to automation going forward. Yes, there are certain tasks that are performed by doctors and lawyers that can be automated away, but not the entire job. Conversely, the jobs of cashiers, the jobs of receptionists, and the jobs of truck drivers are, potentially fully automatable, and most of those jobs earn relatively low wages. And when President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors used our automation probabilities to sort them by wage brackets, what they found is that if you look at jobs which earn less than $20 per day, you see that they have an average automation probability of over 80%. Of jobs that earn more than $40, you see an average automation probability of 4%. And this is sort of basically the complete opposite of what you find if you look at the jobs that can be performed digitally or remotely. And our estimates suggest that in sort of financial services, roughly 80% of jobs can be done at distance during a pandemic. And I think it's important to remember that this doesn't imply that those jobs should be done remotely, with the exception of education, which is unfortunately my own sector. Most of these jobs tend to be high income, so I'm the outlier here. Generally speaking, if you look at sectors like leisure and hospitality, those sort of type of jobs that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic, we see very low levels of remote work potential. And that essentially means that both the pandemic and both automation is sort of perhaps affecting the same set of jobs. But it also has certain implications for developing countries, I would argue, because if we look at patterns of global trade, what we do see is that, well, most is still in goods, but most of the growth in global trade has actually come from services in recent decades, although from a much lower base. And I think there are reasons to believe that this could potentially continue, because if a job can be done remotely, it can also potentially be offshore. And at some point, Oxford University might figure out that somebody in Delhi could do my jobs better than me, and potentially at much lower cost. So something that I tell my students, and this is from a paper by Baldwin and Forslin, is that the future of globalization might look more like India than the Chinese model, with the Indian model obviously being much more based on service exports rather than exports of goods. Now, if we look at digital vacancies across the globe, we find that they are quite clustered in 5 places: Australia, India, Canada, United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, all you will probably know that they have at least one thing in common, which is that they have a large English-speaking population. Conversely, if you look at where the location of most workers are, and this is also before the pandemic, I should say, they are in England, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, United Kingdom, and the United States. So trade in digital labor, and I'm sure we will come back to sort of discussing the social protection side of this as well, because obviously many of these are not stable jobs. But it does sort of illustrate the pattern that the sort of export of services have been very confined to the English-speaking world. But one virtual potential of machine translation is that this growth model could become accessible to a much broader set of countries in the future. And it could also become feasible to see parts of the innovation process, which many people believe is going to continue to be very clustered. But there is some research suggesting at least that parts of it is increasingly happening at distance, at least since the 1990s. That could also be done remotely from lower income countries. At the same time, though, I think it's important to remember that for the patentees that are collaborating, and you can see the increase in the distance between them on this figure here, they had to meet at some point in order to set up a collaboration. And what you do find is that, for example, when important conferences get cancelled, innovation in that field tends to suffer in a given year. You do find that cities with more walkable streets and restaurants exhibit higher levels of innovations. And the obvious point is that those people had to meet somewhere in order to set up a collaboration in the first place. So my view is that the future of the sort of global division of labor can very much be seen through the lens of this project cycle, whereby for me, for example, as an academic, when I want to write a new paper or a new book, I want to go to conferences, go to dinners, go for lunches to explore, get inspired and collect new ideas. But when I want to actually write and execute, I'm very happy to do that remotely in my home, where I'm relatively undisturbed. And of course, that type of work could be divided between people and done at different locations. So I think this is sort of broadly speaking how the new division of labor is evolving when it comes to most projects and innovation. And I look forward to discussing some of the implications of this with you during the session today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating overview of the significant changes that have that we are undergoing. And I'm very curious to hear from you how you see the impact of COVID as well, which in some ways has accelerated probably some of these transitions that you're talking about, but also at the same time the sort of more increased insularity within countries and how that may affect our ability to be service exporters. It's a conversation that is very vibrant in India, and would be very curious to hear your views and how all of this also sort of sits together and how we need to rethink. So I mean, one of the interesting things in India that we're talking about is the importance of thinking about social protection as something that is mobile, that would allow for much more internal migration. And what happens when, and we've not thought about labor that goes across borders in the gig economy. Do we need to think more innovatively about what social protection has on offer? But before that, may I now invite Mr. Rusbeh Irani to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in the Indian scenario, both the kind of disruptions that the labor market is undergoing, the possibilities and potential, and how do we rethink both labor capital relations, and within that the role of social protection.
Yeah, very good evening to all of you, and thank you for your warm introduction, Yamini. Thank you for inviting me, Deepak, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. Let me share with you some of my thoughts on the future of work and social protection in the post-COVID world. Now, I think a lot has been said about this. Can I have the next slide, please? A lot has been said about this, but frankly, automation is not a new concept. Humans and technology have evolved together through the centuries. Over time, we have transferred the more routine and mundane interactions of technology. But in the new world of digital transformation, we are transferring some of the decision-making over to machines also. I think the key point is that this is not a new concept. This has been happening over the centuries. So, we should not see this as a revolution, but as an evolution that we have been going through over time. And it's only made us better and more productive. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, the other key point that I want to make is that COVID has actually, as we all know, accelerated the rise of this digital transformation in more ways than one. So let me just give you some examples of this, right? First of all, companies have responded to COVID-related changes much faster than we could have ever imagined. We at the Mahindra Group set up work for home for 92% of our employees in 72 hours. And this was made possible because of technology, because of collaboration with stakeholders, speed of approvals, as well as innovative thinking. The whole digitization of customer interaction and the entire supply chain has been hugely accelerated. It's sort of accelerated by at least 3 or 4 years. I mean, talking about customer interaction, our real estate business managed to sell 70 to 80% of our new affordable housing project near Mumbai entirely digitally without even having a model house during the COVID period. We at Mahindra reimagined the entire customer experience for the launch of the iconic Thar, which again happened at the peak of COVID. Now, if somebody had told me that this would be possible even a year ago, I would not have believed that person. It's quite incredible what technology has done to the whole transformation of automation, and the way COVID has accelerated this. I'd just like to point out one thing. This concept of the pit stop theory is really about the fact that during a recession, firms are in general more willing to innovate because the opportunity cost of not undertaking any action is much lower than during buoyant times. So you have less to lose by innovating, and therefore you tend to innovate more. And again, that's one of the things that fuels this. I think we all know that we've reached a new equilibrium, and there are lots of things on which there is never going to be a return. There's never going to be a turning back on. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, again, let me emphasize that, yes, there is anxiety on automation, but again, that is not new. If you look across the ages, starting with Aristotle, moving on to Keynes, the fact that machines replace workers has been a reality, right? And people have been concerned about it. I think what we need to be concerned about is one thing only, which is that how can we make better use of labor, and how can we do it faster than the redundancies that will inevitably come about in certain areas because of automation. So there are always better uses of labor. Can we identify them, and can we create more jobs than we lose as a result of technology? Is the only thing we should be concerned about. Can I have the next slide, please? We speak a lot about this concept called digital transformation. While technology does play a role in this, it is, in my view, this is as much about talent as it is about technology. Now, why do I say this? Right? I think, first of all, let me just highlight the fact that innovation is spurred by technology. Capital and labor augmentation with technology actually spurs innovation. I mean, I can give you an example from something that I have personally led in the Mahindra Group. as some of you might know, we are into electric vehicle racing. Okay, we are one of the founding teams of Formula E, which is the equivalent of Formula One, but for EVs. Here, there is more software in the cars than there are parts. And the use of technology has actually enabled us to do race to road transfer, which has helped the development of the absolute top-end electric car called Mahindra Battista that we are going to be launching soon. This is the electric supercar that we are going to be coming out with. Again, importantly, machines substitute tasks, they don't substitute jobs. They automate parts of a job, they increase productivity of workers, and they complement their skills. So I think these are some facts that we need to focus on. And there is a huge shift in the labor market towards more skilled workers, which is also leading to higher compensation. And this higher compensation is offset by a greater degree of labor productivity, which helps companies, but it also puts more spending power in the hands of workers, which is to everybody's benefit going forward. Can I have the next slide, please? I think this is fairly obvious. Routine and predictable tasks have a much higher potential for automation. This is, I mean, we look at all the jobs, we look at all the tasks, and we are remodeling the way we shape jobs. And I think that remodeling then leads to redefining the skills that are needed and the whole process of reskilling, which is at the heart of preparing labor and preparing workers for the future of work. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, I think this is an important slide. This, if I were to, I mean, I'm sorry, this is quite a text-heavy slide, but let me just simplify this for you and pick up the couple of key points I want to make. Right? And I think the first point I want to make is that automation has enabled the democratization of work. As automation breaks jobs into tasks, gig work has been enabled. And that is something that we are seeing, we are embracing. It was always felt that, you know, remote working would be only for very certain select kind of jobs. Today, we know that remote working can be done for a wide variety of roles, and that has really enriched the kind of skills that we can get for different roles. So the whole coming to age of the gig economy has been enabled by automation, and that has caused the democratization of work. We need to be cognizant of that, and we need to build that into our future workforce planning as we go forward. Can I have the next slide, please? I think 2 points on this slide I'd like to highlight. One is the fact that when you look at the skills of the future, except for digital dexterity, all the other skills are human skills. The point is that human skills will not become irrelevant with time or technology. You know, many of us feel that we have to completely reskill ourselves. Yes, we do need to reskill. However, if you ask me, human skills are even more relevant in the future of work than they were in the past. Let's not lose sight of that. And in terms of reskilling, I think we need to we need to look at this through three lenses as individual workers, as individual learners. We need to ask ourselves three questions. First of all, what will drive the economic engine? What will help the organization succeed, right? The second question is, what am I good at? And the third question is, what am I passionate about? And I think the intersection of these three is what I would urge each learner to go forward with. Can I have the next slide, please? You know, ESG used to be a fad in the past. ESG used to be regarded as important, but today it is not an afterthought. It is not something that's nice to do. It's not something that is done in addition to everything else that is that occupies us in corporates. Today, it is at the heart of everything that a firm does or should do. And our social impact is as important as growth. And in fact, the two are not a fork in the road. In the past, it used to be felt that social impact and economic prosperity could be a fork in the road, and a decision needs to be taken which one needs to be pursued more vigorously, right? I think today we are all increasingly aware of the fact that the two complement each other, and creating a social impact goes hand in hand with creating an economic impact, and one without the other is incomplete. And planning our workforce strategy needs to build this reality in mind. We need to be cognizant of the fact that we are to create a social environmental impact along with an economic impact as we go forward, and our actions will be watched by society, and our customers and employees are not going to be rewarding us with economic growth unless we are in it for the social impact also. Can I have the next slide, please?
I think a couple of minutes more because we have.
I'm almost done. This slide, I'll just summarize by saying that the government, industry bodies, organizations, NGOs should focus on reimagining jobs and providing avenues for skilling and reskilling, while the workforce should focus on building their learning agility and leveraging digital tools. Can I have the next slide, please? I think the key point on this slide is that there is a lot of stuff that we as humans can do much better than machines. And if we can just focus on that, it would be a very good complementary situation. And the last slide really summarizes it all by saying that the future is in our hands. We are writing it at the moment. We'll continue to write it, and this will be a subject that will continue to be debated even in the next few decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosbe. May I now invite Elena Sogner to talk to us about the COVID-19 impact, and particularly on the issue of gender and its effects on the labor market, both from the perspective of COVID as well as more broadly. To what extent does industrialization 4.0, the tech revolution, disruption create opportunities and limit opportunities or constraints for female labor force?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to be part of this panel and to talk about these important issues. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay, very good. So I thought that it would be very important for us to discuss also issues of social inequality that the COVID-19 crisis has brought about. And of course, certain trends have been there before the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And I remember that in 2017, we did a there was a big project for the G20 on the impacts of digital transformation, digital technologies on gender equality. So the topic was not new. And the question which I want to address here in this brief presentation is, well, what did COVID-19 crisis change in this relationship? So, of course, we have seen from the previous presentations, and I want to thank the previous presenters for their very detailed presentation of data related to digital transformation during the COVID-19 crisis. So we have seen it, that the digital infrastructure has been developed much more stronger during the COVID-19 lockdown due to the COVID-19 crisis, but also the consumer behavior has changed. And this was evident in the expansion of digital delivery of services by firms, within firms. And we have seen this, the relevance of this change in both education and retail. When we talk about the future of work, I think it is also important to mention digital entrepreneurship. Something which is still to be defined because this is a very heterogeneous phenomenon, but we've seen an increase not just in gig workers, but also in founders of digital platforms. And the Industry 4.0, which there was, by the way, a very interesting informative study by McKinsey very recently. They surveyed manufacturing firms, and they found out that about 90% of them were willing to invest in digital talent. And I think this was mentioned in the previous presentation, that digital transformation is about talent. It's less about technology probably, but also because without the talent we cannot have this transformation. So I tried to find out what do we know about the impacts of COVID-19 and digital transformation on gender equality, which this evidence is very recent because we're still in these difficult times. So the studies so far have agreed that, or found some support that the recession caused by the COVID-19 crisis was a she-session. So women were more heavily affected by the crisis in terms of their well-being and labor market outcomes. So I'm not talking about health risks, because as we know, men had a higher death rate during this crisis than women. But the story about the she-session is not black and white, because it turned out that what is really important is to look into the different subgroups of the population. We see that not all women were affected in a similar way. And in particular, so these are the top 3 findings from the ongoing research on that topic, who was affected more. And we see that, first of all, there is a gender racial gap. We see that certain types of women, Black women, if we're talking about the developed countries, about the US, for instance, and this is the study that was conducted for the US, they had a higher risk of contagion. Why? Because traditionally in the US, Black women work in essential jobs. And this, they were more affected than Black men or white women. So it is important to look into the more narrowly defined gender gaps. Then we have some evidence that families with children suffered more. I think it is no surprise, particularly there was more child losses among mothers than among fathers and women without children. And we also see that women entrepreneurs suffered more. So they've seen stronger decrease in working hours, and their income decreased much stronger than the income of self-employed men. So now, because the digital transformation affected the jobs of workers, and we have seen in the previous presentation how digital technologies affect the world of work, I would like to just briefly focus on the gender equality issue here when we talk about the digital transformation of work. So we can assume that digital technologies are different, right? So when we are talking about AI, we are not talking about general AI. We have different types of AI. We have machine learning algorithms. We have other types of AI, deep learning, and so on and so forth. And this is very important because we have to distinguish between those technologies when we talk about their impacts on labor markets and on jobs. So, for instance, we've seen that robots, and this was, let's say, the previous generation, we still have a lot of robots, and they are also increasingly using AI. But robots were increasingly labor replacing, so they had destructive effects on the labor. And they had less of transformative effects on the labor. So now AI seems to be very different in this respect. And broadly speaking, we can distinguish between the rising stars occupations, and this is where the impact of new digital technologies is very high, but the destructive effects, so labor replacing effects, are relatively low, right? So this is, for instance, what has happened in the education sector. Now we had to teach from remote, right? Telework was very important. So the profession of a teacher belongs to the rising star occupation. On the other hand, we have some occupations which fall in the category of human terrain occupations. And these are the occupations which are virtually not affected by digitalization, right? So before COVID, pre-COVID, we said that, well, these occupations are more safe in the sense that people probably will not, workers will not lose their jobs. But, well, they are also low-paid jobs because people in these jobs, they do not benefit from the digital technologies, right? So they are not becoming more productive in their occupations. So what we found out is that women are overrepresented in human terrain occupations. So on the one hand, they are safe, but the COVID-19 crisis has shown that these occupations, people with these occupations, they suffered a lot because they were not able to use digital technologies to perform their work from remote, right? And in another study, which I also did for the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the focus was on the role of digital gender divide. So what prevents women from being in rising stars occupations, for instance? So why are there more women in human terrain occupations? And here we looked at the distribution of skills in the developing countries. So the focus was on the developing countries, and it seems that women have much less abilities or skills that are important in the digital economy. So this is a huge range of skills, including the, first of all, of course, we can mention that they have less access and they use digital technologies much less frequently. In the developing countries. This is less of an issue in the developed countries, by the way. So this is also an issue of cost of digital technologies, but also in terms of digital skills, we see that this is an issue not just in the developing countries, particularly regarding the advanced digital skills and further skills relevant in the digital economy, such as entrepreneurial skills, for instance, are also not very much developed in women compared to men. So now, again, so this was one aspect of the COVID-19 impact that has shown that human terrain occupations are not very safe, right, compared to what we have thought before. Another aspect of this crisis is the telework, and the research that I reviewed has shown that telework is less accessible to women, which is a very striking finding. And this is not because women are in occupations that are less suitable for telework, not necessarily because even if you compare women and men within the certain industries and occupations, you see that they have had less opportunity than men to work remotely during the first wave of the crisis. So in 2020. So the question is, why is this the case? So this is probably one of the most interesting questions. We could discuss it also later, but probably most obvious reasons are related to their lower digital skills. So the workers' digital capabilities are less developed, but also firms' lower digital capabilities. So maybe firms led by women, where because of exactly this lower digital capabilities, we are less likely to offer telework. Maybe there's an issue of financial constraints. Another explanation would be that firms' organizational culture did not support personal autonomy and flexible working environment. So this is something which could be changed in the future, given that there is a huge potential for telework in women's jobs. Another interesting issue which I would like to address is that we quite often hear that promoting flexible work environments are very important in order to promote gender equality, and I agree with that. However, we quite often forget to mention the challenges of the digital work, not just the telework, but also the work in gig economy. And first of all, this is something which regards the social protection of gig workers, which I hope we will discuss later. Then also very interesting finding is that the gender wage gap persists in the digital platform economy as well. So it's not just an offline economy issue. We also observe gender wage gaps in the platform economy. There is a risk that women might choose or be assigned less valuable tasks in the digital work, so tasks that are less paid. There are issues of mental health that we don't have to forget, and the promotion opportunities. Because what is important in offline jobs work is that we have contact with peers, we have contact with our mentors and our bosses, let's say, and this improves our promotion opportunities. So there's a risk that this will not be the case in the gig economy. So finally, I want just to summarize and maybe open up the floor also for discussion, for questions. So what are the implications of the COVID-19 crisis and accelerated digital transformation for the empowerment of women? I think these 5 issues are particularly important. So first of all, we have seen that not all women are affected in the same way. That's why we have to pay attention to gender biases within certain population groups, and this is why we need more data, right? So we need more data on different types of workers. We have to address adverse impacts of Industry 4.0 on women, and this is something which is particularly relevant for the manufacturing, for instance, in the textile industry, because we see that there are still more women than men in this industry, but there is a defeminization of the sector. So there's less women in this sector, and the number has been decreasing over the last decade. So seems to have to do something with the digital transformation of the industry. We have to address the digital gender divides. We have to think about the flexible work environments that do not increase women's burden. And last but not least, we have to address the gender gaps in the gig economy, which surprisingly do persist in the online digital economy as well. Okay, so some food for thought, I think, also for a discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Alina. I think you've raised some really, really important issues and allows us to segue straight into the discussion. May I request our audience to please put your questions into the Q&A box or the chat box, and I'll try and take them in through the course of our discussion. I think we have it's 10 to 8, so we have about 40 minutes for discussion. So really looking forward to diving deeper into some of the issues that have been raised. I think, both are one of the most striking thing that one is hearing from these presentations is that we're most certainly in a moment of very significant transformation, and where I think I would like to push you all to comment on is what does this mean in terms of the responsibility that capital has to take for addressing vulnerabilities within the labor market. So, for instance, Carl, and if you could speak to this a little bit, I think, even as, so one of the consequences of service-led exports is that it essentially means that it's prioritizing the top layers of the economy, those who labor that is highly skilled. And one of the great puzzles in the Indian economy is how we sort of had premature deindustrialization and premature servicification both happening at the same time, right? I mean, the trickle down, especially as we now venture into automation, what does that do for all those that are left out? So where does the role of private sector and the role of the state come in, and how do the two interface when it comes to skilling and when it comes to addressing vulnerabilities as people lose out on jobs?
I think those are the key questions. I mean, in my opinion, if we go back historically, periods where business took the responsibility for social protection and reskilling did not work out that well. If you look at the United States, you had the rise of welfare capitalism in the 1920s, where businesses offer more generous pension schemes and a whole range of benefits and opportunities. And then the Depression comes along, and the first things that get cut are precisely these welfare schemes. And we should say that there was also a significant degree of paternalism involved in this. So I think the lesson from that is that social protection in general is best provided by the state, and obviously that requires the state to raise taxes to pay for that. And we've seen that has eased resistance to big transformations historically. Britain was the first country to industrialize. It was also the first country to have some meaningful social protection in terms of the poor laws. And if we look across Britain, we see that places where the poor laws were more generous, you also saw less social resistance, less strikes, less upheaval as a consequence of the industrialization process. And I think we need to learn from that. And we have had some encouraging news over the past couple of months in terms of the OECD driving a very comprehensive effort for tax reform and to try to avoid this race to the bottom that we are seeing. And some may argue that 15% corporate income tax is too low as sort of a threshold, but it's certainly an improvement. And we need to make sure that we do raise some tax revenue to pay for this, not at least since we've been through a period of rather unprecedented stimulus, at least in the United States. And now when it comes to reskilling and retraining, the reason that governments play a role there is that because it becomes with what we call positive externalities, right? When we have a more educated population, we tend to have lower levels of crime. If we have a more educated population, we tend to have higher levels of innovation and more democratic participation and so on. But it also means that people can move more swiftly between different jobs of industries because general education tends to provide more transferable skills. Businesses are more likely to invest in skills that are important to a particular occupation and a particular firm, and those skills are absolutely critical and very important, but they most often are also internalized by that company, which has an incentive to invest in them.
Thank you. Riz, may I think one of the interesting things about the way in which the working population in the formal economy, particularly in India, has often resisted the sort of some of the traditional social protection mechanisms available. In the sense, I mean, Manish Sabharwal has this very nice framing of haath ka paisa, chithi ka paisa, the finances, the income that I receive in my hand versus the income that is written in my employment letter, where there's something that's taken away to put into your provident fund, to put in to your retirement benefits, and so on and so forth. And in fact, often this sort of push towards more contractual employment because it enhances salaries that you have in hand, and it also then empowers the individual to choose what kind of savings options or financial options that they want to pick up. How do you sort of interpret this? I mean, how does so I think in India particularly, we have two different kinds of challenges. There is one challenge that is around the informality of the economy and what kind of social protection mechanisms need to be provided for the informal economy, particularly as a safety net. And then there is a formal economy wherein certain kinds of financial tools are often resisted by employees themselves. So how do you see these tensions? Do they exist at all? And how do you think we need to reconcile them as we imagine a new kind of social protection mechanism which needs to be built in the context of technology?
Sorry, was that question for me?
No, it was for Uzbek. I guess the core question I was asking
Can you please paraphrase the question?
Yeah, from your experience, what is the perception of employees vis-a-vis social protection benefits that employers give, and do they see these as constraining or empowering?
Look, I think employees have come to recognize that, particularly in the private sector, right? Companies are a meritocracy, and they should be a meritocracy. People should be paid for the value that they deliver. Otherwise, progress is not going to, otherwise the pace of innovation, the pace of change, and the pace of progress is going to be constrained. And that's going to be to everybody's detriment. Equally, I think, as I stressed during my presentation, the importance of social impact cannot be understated. So companies are as responsible for economic impact as they are for social impact. And it's a flywheel. One should be accelerating the other. So now the social impact should take the form of, for example, women's economic empowerment, skilling, and skilling not just your own workers, but skilling the workforce of the future, whether you will provide them employment or not. So I think gone are the days, in my view at least, when companies took responsibility for a few, and it is few relative to the entire population of a country, or for that matter, world, people that they employ. I think it's a far greater and far more relevant responsibility to ensure that the flywheel of economic growth and social impact keeps moving in a positive manner. And that is going to be the biggest contribution that the private sector can make.
Thank you. Carl, we have a question from Pratik specifically for you. Pratik is asking that in the pre-COVID period, creative economy had gained some traction for offering technology resilient job opportunities. But COVID seems to have had a more severe impact on these jobs than others. Do you see a creative economy 2.0 in a post-COVID world?
By creative economies meant creative industries, so theater, music, that sort of thing. Well, I think it's a bit early to say to what extent that will rebound. I mean, I've seen some survey evidence from Europe and the United States, which suggests that roughly a quarter of the population say they are less likely to go to a concert venue or a restaurant or to movie theater, and clearly that means that these business models that have evolved over the past couple of decades probably need to change to some extent, and indeed they were changing even before the pandemic. Netflix and other companies were doing quite well in that space, but it also obviously means that we see much more concentration in creative industries, and that is a key concern for people that used to work at the movie theater, or used to work at the concert hall, and used to work at the gallery, which has been hit by the pandemic. So I do think that we're seeing some rebound, but to what extent creative industries are going to rebound as they were, I think is a very much an open question.
Can I ask you? You highlighted a very, very critical issue on particularly around the impact of the automation and technology acceleration on gender and on female labor force participation. If we were to ask ourselves a question, then against this backdrop, do we need to be thinking very differently from a policy perspective about the kinds of social protection interventions we need to make specifically for the female labor force itself? I mean, one important point you made that it's around lower digital potential of lower digital skills, flexibility may not always be empowering, which is somewhat counterintuitive, and different kinds of there are different kinds of identity and ethnic cleavages that you can't even think of gender as a category in and of itself, because there are different cleavages that affect the ability of women to participate in the workforce. But I'm not sure that we have actually been able to extend that conversation into, or extend that understanding into, a policy dialogue on, do we then need to be thinking about social protection tools very, very differently? And I was curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yamini. You raise a very important question, which I also addressed in my publication, actually, because the main issue here with the gender equality policies is that, well, they rely on data that are available, particularly when we're talking about the developing countries. Of course, we have gender disaggregated data, but quite often this is not sufficient data sources. Quite often they distinguish between, for instance, gender labor statistics in rural regions or in urban regions, right? So what is very important is to look at the regions within the countries. So the best we have is this distinction between the rural and versus urban regions, but the industries, they are local. Right, of course, they contribute a lot to the country's GDP, and it is important to have a look at the country level as well. But the industry is local in a certain region, not just rural versus urban region, but they're in the regions within the countries. And so women might be affected, or gender equality in general can be affected very differently across regions within country. Looking at the textile industry in, I don't know, Bangladesh, for instance, again, this is something which is local, and women in cities might have different issues than women in the regions where the textile industry is particularly strong. So I think that coming back to your question, one challenge which we have is to develop regional policies for gender equality, including also social protection issues, which are very sensitive of the gender or of the regional aspect, regional dimension. And so in order to realize this, we of course would need to have data as researchers, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a researcher. We would need to understand the differences in gender equality within regions, between regions within the country, because I suspect they might be much more pronounced than gender differences between countries.
Thank you. Carl and Roseberry, I have a question from Deepak. Pramod, did you want to make an intervention as well? Sorry. Okay, I have a question.
After Deepak.
Okay.
I have a question as well. After
Great.
Deepak.
So let me pose Deepak's question and then I'll come to you in a moment. Pre-pandemic, Deepak says the big debate was how rapidly automation will disrupt jobs. Pandemic has, of course, accelerated this, and yet today we are seeing massive job shortages in some of the most connected and automated countries in the world. Did we all fall prey to Keynes' pessimism of technological unemployment?
Well, I do think that there is a relationship historically between actually labor shortages in particular and automation, and the Russell modelers developed a model along those lines. And it's one of the reasons, if you look at the United States, why mass production technology was developed there first, is that the United States did have massive labor shortages, and that changed or shaped the trajectory of technological development in the US in ways that weren't feasible in Europe, and partly explains, why America overtook Britain and other European economies. But I do think also that if you look at the period of mass production, yes, it was a time with the introduction of labor-saving technology, but it was also a time where you had a sort of prosperous middle class, and you had a virtuous cycle by which you could use labor-saving technology to create cheaper goods, but at the same time, huge demand created huge new industries, which also at the same time absorbed a lot of labor. So it was a demand elasticity there that put us on this virtuous cycle. I don't think that the age of automation we've seen since the sort of 1980s is the same. I do think that we are in a period of more labor replacing technological change. We are seeing sort of greater saturation in many old mass production industries. So I do think that this time is different, but to what extent these labor shortages will persist, I think is also very much a question to be seen. I mean, here in Britain is also in large part due to the fact that Brexit has, made it harder for people that used to work in the UK as lorry drivers and other occupations. Of course, massive shortages, and as some will probably have seen in the news, that made it hard for us to get simple things like petrol.
So would you in that backdrop then say a universal basic income kind of framework for social protection is an inevitability, or rather a necessity, and policymakers should really be looking at it much more seriously?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, if you look at a country like Sweden, there's a generous welfare state. it's targeting people at the lower end of income distribution who needs, transfers. And if you replace existing welfare transfers with the UBI, what you're effectively doing unless you increase taxes, is sort of redistributing income away from people at the lower end of the income distribution to the middle and the top. But I think it's absolutely clear that, a UBI would be better than nothing in a lot of places. And I think one of the challenges a country like India has, for example, is that a lot of people are reliant on the families for social protection. And paradoxically, what the welfare state does, it makes people more individualistic, as you see in Sweden. Sweden is one of the most individualistic countries in the world, precisely because of the welfare state, which makes people less dependent on family, more mobile. Young Swedish people are more likely to live by themselves than anywhere in the world. That is not necessarily a good thing. So there's been a lot of loneliness throughout the pandemic, but when it comes to labor mobility and the ability to workers to move into cities where new jobs are being created, I think social protection is very important, whether it comes in terms of a universal basic income or some other sort of scheme. I think that's sort of more of a secondary question. Personally, I would support something like a negative income tax along the lines proposed by Milton Friedman. But you need to recognize that every country is different. It has sort of its pre-existing social arrangements, and it's more feasible in some places than others.
Thanks. Rosbe, did you want to come in on this? And then I'll go to Pramod for his question.
Sure. Thank you, Yamini. I mean, I think the short answer to this question is yes. I think, clearly, there are huge opportunities but they're in different segments. And I think recognizing which those segments are ahead of time, and some of them are fairly obvious: digital, data science. I would even emphasize design. We tend to forget that design is timeless. Good design is something that will always be desired by the consumer of today, tomorrow, the day after, right? Unless we suddenly all become extremely left-brained, which is unlikely. So there are these opportunities. There's also, as I mentioned, the whole concept of democratization of work that technology has enabled. So a lot, and since jobs have now been broken down into tasks, and some tasks have been automated, right? There are other tasks that need to be done by people who can do them best, right? Without being encumbered by some of the more routine tasks which also went along in that job. Today, the whole job has been redefined. So I think with all these realities, there is a set of jobs that has come to the table. There is a set of jobs which has come to the table in all the emerging economies because remote working is possible. And in those kind of roles, demand is chasing supply. So I think it's just a matter of ensuring that we skill our workforce in the right skills, for the right jobs, and anticipate it ahead of time.
Pramod?
Thank you, Yamini. Really appreciate it. I have a very non-economist question, if I'm allowed such a task on this panel. As an entrepreneur and as a former corporate citizen, one of the things that we are seeing, which is very intriguing for us, is to try and understand and analyze how the employee workforce has changed its attitudes pre and post-COVID. There are many, many companies around the world struggling intensely with people whether or not people are willing to come back to work, the kind of work that they're willing to do, the terms under which they want to work. as well as perhaps the flexibility that they now demand, which perhaps they didn't earlier. We're seeing this across the board. We're seeing Jamie Dimon insisting that people come to work or losing their jobs. We're seeing many other companies saying we give you flexibility till perhaps sometime mid next year, and then finding that actually dragging people back into work is proving to be extremely hard. This is much more of an open-ended question for discussion, really, to say, I would love to hear from the panelists what they think has changed fundamentally versus just only the short term in the attitudes of our workforces, our employees, especially women who will think very differently about this, certainly from men, and how that may affect industries across the board. In particular, I think most of us feel that whereas earlier there may have been productivity gains in working from home, it now seems quite clear in most cases that there are many productivity losses and not gains. I would just love to hear from the panelists, and I hope the audience also would like to hear about this, because I do believe there are some profound fundamental changes that have happened, which are actually harder for us to understand because history will tell us that. Last point I would just make, which I would love your thoughts on, is, the Economist, of course, had some wonderful articles in terms of how people search for the meaning of life and the meaning of work itself has changed, and they expect and demand more meaning, just given the fragility of life that they see ahead of us. With that kind of behavior coming much more into play globally, and with attitudes being very different across the world, across many parts of the world, how do organizations tackle this globally? I'll leave it at that. I know it's the most open-ended question I could have asked, but I would love some responses.
Thanks, Pramod. Wonderful questions, and I'm sure our panelists have a lot to say on this. Alina, maybe I can start with you, and I think it's also worth just caveating that a lot of the changes that you're talking about, Pramod, are very much changes in the formal sector, and in some senses, perhaps. And Alina, I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course, to Pramod's question, but also on this reflection is, are we then also seeing a deeper inequality in the labor market, in the sense that much of the productivity gains and potential productivity losses, which I too am beginning to feel that even in my work, that the first year of lockdown was so unusual and everyone sort of mobilized, and now the energy levels are waning and it's getting difficult to get people back into work because we've got used to a different way of working, and it has its positives and negatives. But those a lot of those luxuries are not available in the informal sector, and of course the consequences of economic lockdowns on the informal sector were significant and very, very widely visible in India. So there's also a sort of the well-being aspect of working life, and are we going to see even deeper inequalities there, both in terms of gender but as well as income and class? Your reflections on that, and then I'll come back to Carl and Ruspe as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pramod, for your question. Also interesting to see your perspective as an entrepreneur. And I think that our attitudes have changed a lot during the COVID. So our attitudes as consumers, our attitudes as employees, and some of these changes have been there already pre-COVID. I think that people wanted to have some flexibility. They wanted to go for a working week with less working days, that they have to be present in the office. So now during the lockdown, we've seen that probably there is an optimal number of working days that they want to stay away from their office, because when we're all in the lockdown, we missed something, right? So we did not want to be remote for all the time. So probably it is an important step, and this is something that employees do wish, and some governments have pushed for having the right for employees to work certain number of days from remote, to do telework. So this is important. But probably it should not be completely remote. Why not? For many different reasons. I've briefly mentioned them in my presentation, such as well-being and mental health. We need social connections. We cannot stay away from our peers because it is important for learning, right? So we only learn if we communicate with others. And this is also related to the question of abilities, building of digital capacities. It is important to be together with others to discuss the ideas, maybe to come up with entrepreneurial ideas, because we're talking about universal basic income and the labor replacing digitization, but actually digital technologies do create entrepreneurial opportunities for someone to recognize them and to pursue them, to build digital enterprises. So I think we have to, when we talk about the future of work, we cannot forget about the role of entrepreneurship in the digital economy. So what types of entrepreneurial opportunities are there? Who creates them? What types of firms do create them? Who are the workers who pursue those opportunities? And here, also connecting to the topic of my presentation, my research as well, gender inequality, I believe that this will be a particularly difficult, a particular challenge for women and digital entrepreneurs, because we already have less women as entrepreneurs in the offline economy. In the digital economy, different types of skills are needed in order to be a digital entrepreneur. And as we know, women are less likely to have access to technology. When we're talking about developing countries in particular, they are less likely to have digital skills required in order to set up a digital enterprise. And I'm not talking about knowing how to use a smartphone. It's about knowing how to build an app, how to create an app, how to create a digital platform. This is what digital entrepreneurship is about. It's not about selling the goods on a platform which is already there. Right? Digital entrepreneurship is about creating value which is completely digital. So I think these are some of the main challenges that we will have to deal with in the post-COVID world, hopefully soon.
Thank you for that, Elena. We're almost at the close of the session, but Rozbeh, may I request you to, as an entrepreneur, from the private sector, as an entrepreneur yourself, managing human resources in a large company, your perspectives on these issues will be very valuable.
Yeah, no, I think these are very good questions. I mean, I think our knowledge on this is continuing to evolve. It would be very highly presumptuous of me to say that we have the answers. We don't, because the questions themselves are evolving. I think that's the first reality I'd like to emphasize. The second thing I'd like to say is that while the last 18 months has shown us that it is possible to work remotely, and it is possible in many jobs, many more jobs than we earlier imagined, to work, to sort of do remote working. Equally, it has shown us that there are many negative implications. And I think the one thing that I would like to hone on focus on is the importance of mental and psychological wellness. We all knew that was important even in the past, but I think this period has made it front and center. I think the biggest suffering has been in the mental and psychological space. I think physical problems have been relatively minor compared to mental and psychological. What it has also, I think, shown us more recently is the advantage of being together in a workplace. And frankly, I can tell you from my personal experience, ever since I've come back to the workplace, I'm feeling absolutely, I'm feeling in a different mind space. I mean, it's so good to be among your colleagues, to be able to walk into a room, even if it's with a mask on, and be able to get things done and share insights rather than just stare into a computer screen all day. So frankly, I see big advantages of getting back to the workplace. I think more and more people are seeing that, but I think that will only happen when it is completely safe to make that happen. That's how I'd like to summarize it.
So the office is not dead yet. I remember in April or May last year, the New Yorker had this long article on how the office is dead, and it clearly 1.5 years later, there are some merits to the office. But I do think that the inbuilt flexibility and that now we have discovered, even conversations like this are here to stay. So we're probably going to see some newer version of a hybrid. Hyper globalized, despite I mean, that's the irony of COVID, that suddenly national borders became so crucial to shaping our imaginations, and at the same time, because of technology, we were all in a hyper way connected to each other, that the workday would begin. Last week I did a Zoom panel with on Pacific time at 12:30 at night in Delhi, and I really thought the tyranny of Zoom needs to end now. It has advantages and disadvantages, but I think what we've learned from this panel today is both that the globe was on such a crucial trajectory of a significant shift in thanks to technology in labor capital relations. COVID-19 has accelerated these, brought on board new challenges, labor shortages, gender inequity, broad-based inequality, but at the same time opened up new opportunities as well, all of which I think are placing new challenges to policymakers. And my view is that as a policymaking community, we are still coming to terms with what all of this means in terms both of how one can provide for an enabling environment for this creative reshaping and renegotiation to take place. At the same time, ensuring that there is adequate protection to labor, especially those parts of labor that are facing deeper vulnerabilities in the context both of COVID, but also what the accelerated technological advancements are doing. And for countries like India, the fact that we still have to resolve the 20th century challenges. I think one of the biggest eye-openers for India, which we should have been headline news consistently over the decades and never quite made it, is that to the extent that we have a social protection architecture, it is primarily rural. It doesn't address the worker that moves from rural to urban. It doesn't create an enabling environment that allows even the traditional labor capital relations to organize themselves in ways that protect both workers, both labor and capital. In fact, we have a regulatory regime that systematically ensures that it enables neither labor nor capital to be effectively protected. Therefore, we need to both think about what are the contours of an effective social protection architecture for 20th century challenges, but then also be more agile to build one that is genuinely mobile, adaptive, and iterative, and responsive to new challenges. What does reskilling mean in all of this too poses very, very important questions. And where does the relationship between the role of the state and the role of the private sector begin and end? Also, I think, challenges for the future that we will be debating for quite some time now. So thank you for such provocative presentations, thought-provoking presentations, wonderful questions, and really looking forward to continuing this engagement. And I hope that we'll bring in the gender question in all our discussions going forward as well. So thank you, Alina, for reminding us of the complexities of that as well. Thank you. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you very much, Yamini and Rusbe, Carl, Alina. This was a terrific evening. I must say that there are a bunch of people in YouTube and we did manage to scrape through their questions and pass it on, though we didn't get an opportunity to ask all the questions. But just want to thank all the people who stayed back. We have about 50 to 60 people throughout the session, and that's a large number given that this is the second session of the day. And that's thanks to all the wonderful presentation, the discussion we had. So just a very sincere thanks from all of us in ICRIER to the panelists and to the audience for staying late and listening to this. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much as well.
And thanks, Yamini, for a
you.
wonderful moderation.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the session. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.